éxito de cómo generar recursos de audiencia y luego
lo que vamos a anunciar con el
y centro.
Centroamérica y el resto de países. Gabriela, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Ricardo. Voy a presentar a Ken Doctor. Vamos a hacer esta presentación en inglés por facilidad del panelista. Así que bueno, good morning. Good morning, Ken. I'm going to briefly present you. Ken Doctor is a renowned news industry analyst and author of the book Newsonomics, 12 Trends That Will Transform the News You Consume. 4 years ago, he founded the news platform Lookout Local in his hometown of Santa Cruz, California. He is also an analyst and consultant at the research firm Outsell and a regular speaker and advocate for the reinvention of local news. He spent 21 years at Knight Ridder in various roles, including the editor-in-chief of the St. Paul Pioneer Press and vice president of Knight Ridder Digital. Moreover, however, Ken is a leading advocate for proposing solutions to the commonly known but perhaps poorly understood news deserts, solutions for replacing the giant void left by dying daily newspapers in some of our communities, solutions for independent journalism sustained by revenue generated by advertising and circulation, and not philanthropy, government, or political interests. For that, we've asked Ken to tell us about his belief in community betterment and how this driving force can be the pillar of new ways to found, build, and sustain local news outlets. Ken, as we all know, there are abysmal differences between Latin America and the United States in terms of size of the market, the economy, audiences, and even literacy and cultural traits. However, there are common traits for which we can draw useful analogies. And so perhaps we can start by talking about the challenge posed by big media conglomerates in the United States, because in a way, in Latin America, independent media also face enormous challenges from media conglomerates based on either government funding or political funding. So perhaps we can start talking about what the scenario is in the United States and how we can draw some lessons for Latin America.
Sure.
Good afternoon.
So I have, we can have discussion. I have some slides to show kind of what's going on here. Which do you prefer?
Perhaps we can look at your slides and then start the conversation there, and then we can take it from there.
And very glad to be with you all. I think I can't remember the last time we spoke in person. It was a couple of times over the years. It was very good to be with you. I wish it was all better times for all of us, but unfortunately, the trends have continued. There are, and I appreciate the introduction from Gabriela. The times are tough, but there are a lot of shoots of what is coming and what can be positive, and both on a fairly small level and on a large level. So let's have a discussion as to what is now possible. Let me call it up here. And absolutely feel free to pose a question and make a comment as I go along here.
Great.
So we all know the story of what's going on. We live it every day. And for me, this is, I think, my 6th career in journalism now. And so I've become a publisher again, as well as an analyst. I'm actually playing dual roles at this time in the United States with all of the ferment that's going on. Nationally, you see these kind of headlines. BuzzFeed News, not really a big surprise. They had 60 people left. If you remember, all these Vox, Vice, Mike, HuffPost, they were going to be the replacements for the New York Times. I remember the HuffPost proclaiming it would do that. They have all now receded into the background nationally. And guess what? The Journal, the Times, and the Washington Post are ascendant. So broadly here, broadcast TV is fairly stable, although very worried. In the United States, they get retransmission money from cable and satellite, and that's they believe going away in the next 3 to 5 years. So stable here, as in many places, TV is much more superficial in what it covers locally than what newspapers traditionally do. Public broadcasting is cutting at a national level. they're having financial problems. Facebook, as we know, has abandoned news, and Google, with all of the regulatory and legal actions against it, is pondering what is its future. So the platforms are not as much of a player as they were in news. Now, in terms of the daily newspaper industry, which here, as you know, was incredibly strong, 25% margins for many years. Now, 50% of the dailies in the United States are owned by financial players. And they are just squeezing them. They are squeezing them. They have debt. It is a downward spiral. That's 50%. What's more interesting is, and those tend to be the larger papers, not all of them, but most of them, are the family-owned papers that are some individual families and some newer chains that have bought up smaller dailies and larger weeklies across the country, and are really applying efficiencies, the digital efficiencies, staff efficiencies, and see a future, although it's still a very tough business for them. They are amassing small chains and they are trying to grow, although it is fitful. Importantly here, and I talked to the newspaper brokers, valuations are still plummeting. You can buy these papers that used to sell for 8 to 10 times annual EBITDA for one-time revenue. It is, and Gannett itself, the largest company, has divested a bunch of newspapers. So it is a tough time in that traditional newspaper business. And so the urgency of replacing, as Gabriela noted, these fading dailies, especially at the top end, is only increasing. Gannett is the biggest story. Gannett, and which is now really the Gatehouse company, which bought Gannett and took its name, owns 25% of the press in the United States. You can see these headlines. You're familiar with these headlines. Layoffs have increased a lot, not just at Gannett, but most of these larger chains over the last year, and really over the last 5 years. Story from Josh Benton at the Neiman Lab a few months ago of the tremendous loss of journalists. There's I am in Santa Cruz, which is central coast of California, and about an hour away from us is Salinas. This is a daily that just got national press because it's a daily with no reporters left, literally zero, and the editor, quote unquote editor of the paper, is an hour and a half away. This is actually happening in many Gannett markets, but not yet reported. Here's just one example. This is one of the Gannett papers, and you can see the circulation loss. This is daily print and Sunday print. So the print circulation, and these papers are charging as much as $600 and $800 a year to largely very old readers, 75 plus, but they're still losing a lot of circulation. This is not an uncommon rate of loss. Where I started my operation, Lookout Santa Cruz, 2.5 years ago, we have the Santa Cruz Sentinel, owned by Alden, which has gotten pretty notorious in the United States for its buying and eviscerating, really, of daily newspapers and staff. This headline from last November kind of summed it up, that after gutting local newspapers, hedge fund Alden Global is now doing the same to mobile home parks. So this is a societal problem, as we know. We know our place in the press, in the democracy, and we also see the further damage that these financial owners have done. And we are pointing now beyond it in the United States. Here is one example, and I want to come back to it. I know the people at the Daily Memphian pretty well, and it's a very interesting case, I think, for us all of what is possible. Memphis is I think the second biggest city in Tennessee, fairly large metropolitan area, of 1.5 million or so. And the commercial appeal on the right is a Gannett-owned paper that went through several ownerships. And about 5 years ago, civic leaders in Memphis decided that they were tired of the shrinking newspaper that was largely run out of Nashville, about 2 hours away. And they raised $8.2 million and they decided to start their own nonprofit newspaper, online only, digital only, called the Daily Memphian. At that point, they hired 27 people in the newsroom. The Commercial Appeal had 28 at that point. Today, the Daily Memphian has 40. The Commercial Appeal has about 23. And the Daily Memphian now has 17,000 subscribers. They are aiming to get to 25,000 in the next couple of years. This is one of our best examples of replacement. This is, if you look at the site, although it is paywalled, you will see that it is a very traditional news coverage, but it is all digital. And they are beating the print competition head to head. We will see more of this kind of competition. So Ricardo, Horacio, and Gabriela and I talked yesterday and really want to concentrate on the model. What are we looking for the 2020s? Incomplete picture, but I think there's a fair amount there, and I want to draw from my own experience in starting Lookout Santa Cruz here in November 2020, and from both daily print publishers that are making a way forward and other digital startups. In terms of print, it's very interesting that while we have, and you see a lot of attention being placed on Gannett and Alden and Lee and McClatchy, those four financially driven companies, as there should be given how many papers they own. There are quietly now, there are dailies that are making their way through to a very successful digital transformation. On the left, you have Frank Blethen in the Seattle Times. Frank, I just saw him at a conference. He has stayed the course. This is a family newspaper. Seattle Times is now by far the biggest news organization in the Pacific Northwest, surpassing the Oregonian that used to be the biggest, but has cut back. And their blend of keeping their newsroom intact, really importantly, of having a good mix of veteran and younger journalists, and of profoundly accepting that digital is the way forward, both in their news products and in advertising, is giving them a future. I recently visited PJ Browning over there in the lower right. She is the publisher in Charleston, South Carolina, and you probably haven't heard too much about them. There's not very much writing going on. I stopped writing when I started Lookout. I used to do a weekly column for the Neiman Journalism Lab, and I stopped doing that, and I like to recognize people like PJ. Amazing story, really. That's a map of South Carolina, and Charleston is over there more in the lower part of the state. It is a family-owned business. They made it through. They kept their newsroom intact. They started adapting to digital methodology. And then they saw that the other major newspapers in the state, largely owned by the McClatchy Company, which went through a bankruptcy here about 1.5 years ago, 2 years probably, that they were cutting back, and they said, we can serve the whole state. And what they're doing is they have their print base in Charleston, very prosperous city of about 400,000. But then there are smaller places all around the state that they have deployed both a newsroom staff and an advertising staff that is digital. And they just announced hiring 17 more people. This is a really interesting model that if you keep your costs low and you use your base really effectively, you can actually grow as these other publishers shrink. So what we have here and what we're seeing, and what I've seen in Santa Cruz too, that while we talk about news deserts and ghost newspapers, this is also a real business vacuum. When these publishers essentially commit suicide by cutting their staffs to the bone, they are opening up a business opportunity. Then there are hundreds of small startups. This is Lion. There's Lion Publishers and INN. You can see all of these logos there. Most of these are local. Some are ethnic and national publications, but many publications. But the truth about these is most of them only have 2 or 3 people. Some do really good journalism. Some do mediocre journalism. few of them really have the appetite or the capacity to replace failing newspapers as a central point of information and news for their communities. But some will. But there's a lot of them right now, and there's a lot of attention being given to them, especially by these guys. So we are lucky to some extent in the United States to have a very strong foundation community that is much stronger here than in many parts of the world, we realize. Taking philanthropy for investment, I did some for when I started Lookout here. That's great. So too many of these companies, these are almost all nonprofits, are really looking to these major foundations for funding, and importantly, ongoing funding. These foundations led, MacArthur Foundation, of course, a major one led by John Palfrey, has said the problem of American democracy cannot be solved without a strong local press. And he has led a new movement, which is talking about $250 million to $1 billion in funding for local news. But guess what? They don't know where they're going to put it. So this is a kind of a strange time, a lot of ferment here, and something to note. And at the same time, I believe, and I believe most of you would too, this is still about building and maintaining a strong business and not being reliant on philanthropy, even if you can get it sometimes. A lot here to talk about as well. We just want to mention this in the US, a lot of movement now in the states because the Congress nationally did not pass any legislation to help local news publishers. But in about 8 states, there are various initiatives to provide tax incentives for subscribers to local news, tax incentives for advertisers buying advertising in local news publications, print or digital, and tax incentives for publishers hiring and retaining journalists. We'll see how many of these actually get activated in the next couple of years. And the idea here is nobody wants to see direct government funding of the press, but if you can incent subscribers or advertisers or incent hiring, it's considered distanced enough so that there wouldn't be the influence of government. There's a lot here as well. So one of my questions moving forward on this, and I still have these twin hats of being an analyst and a publisher, is can the best of the dedicated print, the kinds of companies like the Seattle Times and the Post and Courier in South Carolina, and I would add to that the Boston Globe and Dallas Morning News and Minneapolis Star Tribune and others that are smaller, can they work with the best of the new digital press? And I think the answer is yes, but that's really just beginning. What really unites the best of both of these is this belief in community betterment, and I want to get into that. Now, what's clear going forward is that there is a huge efficiency in digital. So those of us who are starting new digital enterprises see that unlike traditional newspapers, where in the United States, the number was 12.5% of expenses for traditional newspapers would go to the newsroom. In our case, 75–80%, and this is true of the digital startups overall, 75 to 80% of the costs are in people. Most of that is the newsroom, of course, and only 20–25% in tech and non-salary G&A. So this is an increasingly efficient business financially. We see the tech stacks that are now possible work better than ever, and they are relatively cheap. Such things as, and I think of the floors where I used to work at the Pioneer Press in St. Paul 30 years ago, and a whole floor for finance, a whole floor for human resources. This is outsourced fractional help. and both allowing the focus and a very small expense to get this work done for these new enterprises. And so being lean is hugely important to the success of these new enterprises. Very importantly, we're not talking about producing a new product. We're talking about producing a series of products, and I'll show that in a minute. And then, you know, the words of the year have been AI, and there's a lot of confusion, a lot of fear, as is the case these days with so many things. But there will be a lot of possibility in lower cost, multiple product creation and distribution from these new technologies that will help publishers of all kinds. I want them to enable the publishers that really care about their communities. Just on tech stack, this kind of shows what we're doing here. All outsourced. We don't have tech staff on our site. We're 70% mobile. Works very well and costs us relatively little. This is one group that is that we've gotten a lot of attention on. It's called the Alliance for Sustainable Local News. I was a co-founder of it with publishers of these 5 other sites in Baltimore, Chicago, Denver, Memphis, and Long Beach. What is important about these sites and why we've gotten national publicity, this is a national podcast, for instance, is this. The ideas driving these is that we're going to replace the failing daily newspapers in the cities that we're in. We're the smallest. We're only the area in Santa Cruz County is only 267,000, for instance, and then these vary by metropolitan area from 500,000, 1.5 million, and up. But all of us believe that you need to have enough investment to have enough staff to offer a big enough product to the public, enough for the readers, that's going to generate a big enough audience for advertisers to make their advertising effective. Not a new idea, but one that is very different than many of these smaller nonprofits are doing. Now, importantly, some of these companies are nonprofits, some are for-profit, but they are all driven both by mission, by serving these communities with news in the 2020s and not shrinking from that role. And they are business driven. This is not a contradiction. In fact, we believe these things have to go together. And as I was saying about philanthropy, happy to take it in as investment or to supplement what can be done, but all are aiming for profitability on earned and recurring revenue. There are others that are going to join this group soon as well. There are probably, I'd say, a dozen operations like this around the country, and our hope is to see more of those in the next couple of years. I mentioned this, and this is a good example. We could take each of these markets and we could see similar progress as a daily newspaper has receded and these enterprises are growing. So what's the model here? I had a really interesting conversation with the head of digital operation at Newsday at a conference about a month ago. And, you know, we have been so confused, I think, for 25 years maybe on what digital changes and what digital doesn't change. In this case, we're talking about push and pull. So if you push a product to people, as we did on the left, we delivered the newspapers to people's homes. Then they read it. It wasn't they had to go searching for it. We're doing the same thing today with newsletters. Newsletters are just like home delivery. And pull, in the old days, we'd say, okay, for most, other than the biggest urban papers, home delivery, and this is true in the United States and probably unevenly true in Latin America, we'd say single copy was a good supplement. We don't expect that many people to go out to a corner newsstand or a coin box, but that was good to supplement the home delivery. But what we did in digital is we created a site and we expected the people to come to it, just as if we would have expected people just to go to a newsstand. That is why we see such a tremendous emphasis on newsletters today. It makes it much easier to deliver the news to people, and that's where they see the value, and that's why we see paid newsletters. So there's a lot in there as well. Where the big money, of course, the question is, the only question that counts is, how are we going to have enough money to pay enough journalists to do the work of local news and democracy? That's the enduring question I've been focused on for 20 years now. So we know the old standbys, advertising and circulation. Well, the new standbys aren't really that much different, and I don't think they're going to be. But it is digital advertising and digital circulation. And there's a huge amount of difference in how those are done, the costs of doing those, and how to be effective. Here is our model at Lookout. And as we approach our third year, November 20th will be the end of the third year for Lookout, and we will be profitable at that point, which was our original intention. And I'm pretty satisfied with that, especially after going through all the twists and turns of COVID. This is our revenue mix. Advertising is doing really well. Not only do failing newspapers leave a news desert and opportunity for serving readers, we have heard from advertisers that they need places to advertise, and they like the effectiveness and the metrics shown by digital. So for us, marketing partners right now is 50%. That's advertising of our mix. Membership is another 35% of the mix. And then we have an ambitious student program of providing access, free access paid for by individuals and philanthropy. But also we have a full-time person working at the schools with the teachers, creating curriculum. And then a position and a half at this point that is targeted philanthropy, where somebody who cannot dictate coverage, but can say, I want to pay for a certain area of coverage because I believe it's important, and I realize you may not be able to do it yet, given your size. And then with programs like Google Showcase starting, a small amount of money from content licensing. This kind of mix, I think, will change over time. And here you can see some of what is in each of these buckets. I think the mix will change, but I think still what is compelling about this is that model that existed for a couple hundred years of advertising and circulation is still the model going forward. And there was a lot of doubt, there's still a lot of doubt in the US industry that there is much digital advertising. And I would say it's true of all of these new members of the alliance that I mentioned, have found that that's not true. That if you create good ad products, people want to use them. So we have 15 people in our company, 10 in the newsroom, 5 on the business side. And here it kind of just sums up where we're going. We are looking at expansion in 2024. And important, I think, in these notes are that they are it's a diversified revenue stream. In a sense, this is business 101. You've got to find diversified revenue. Even if you believe a lot in reader revenue, as companies like the New York Times do, you have to have diversified revenue. And what is also hugely important, I think, is culture and workforce. We now have people across 6 different decades working at our company, and we are creating a pipeline for the future, both in business and in the newsroom, of people who will run these media companies for the next couple of decades. Here are just some stats to show you kind of what we are doing in Santa Cruz here. Importantly, email, of course, is important, as it is to all of you, the 6 weekly newsletters that we do. And we are growing really quickly at this point. We actually hit an inflection point 6 months ago, and the growth since then has been about 32% in the last 5-6 months at this point. Importantly is the product mix. So I mentioned earlier, we're not just creating a website. 30% of the traffic's on the website, but 70% is on the phone. And these newsletters, and we have 6 now, we'll soon have 9, are the most important, we think, for driving traffic, driving conversion to membership, and for advertising. But we're also doing forums. We're also all over Instagram with Reels. We are using every means we can to get to different audiences. And the same thing is true with our ad products. We discovered 8 months ago that Instagram Reels were something that advertisers really thought they wanted, had no idea how to do it. And now that is our foot in the door. Today, we have 26 active advertisers on the site. I'd say about half of them probably are brought in through Instagram. They love that kind of thing, but we're also doing all kinds of display advertising for them. And we find the formats work really well. I mentioned students. We have a number of students signed up. We think this is really important to mission, but we also think it's another way to bring dollars in the door. That there are people who see the need. It's kind of an easy sell in a way that media literacy is imperiled in the TikTok age. And if we can both fulfill our mission and get paid for supplying this content, local content to students, and maybe to teachers, we're looking at a program to get it to teachers as well, that this can be part of the model, both mission and business model. We've got a lot of teachers now using it in the classroom, actually using our materials. And these are some of the materials that our Director of Student Engagement has created, both for students and for educators, all done by one person and gotten tremendous traction over the last 6 months. So lastly, is there a special sauce to this? And I'll go back to what Gabriela mentioned, which is community betterment. I had this notion when we started that, and the reason that we do this is, and I've been doing it now 40 plus years. The reason we do this is we believe that journalism is important. But why do we believe it's important? Well, we believe that in a democracy, we can make a better life for people who live in the area if they have a good source of news and information. And if we can, especially through digital means and forums, engage them in solving the many problems in front of all of our communities. So what we did, and what we've increasingly done, is put this mission right at the entrance to Lookout. People see this every day. They see it in the pages of it. That's what we're trying to do. It doesn't affect our journalism in any negative way. We still report as traditional journalists would, without fear or favor. But we know why we're doing it, which is community betterment. And one guiding principle is pretty interesting, is just show up in the communities. And what we've seen from these dailies, that we're never, in truth, and it's true when I worked there, really good at showing up in the community. How do you show up? You have your reporters out there all the time, talking to people and reporting. You have your business people out there talking to partners and would-be partners. You gather your members together and hear what they have to say. You do community forums. And we have programs for civic partners, marketing partners, media partners. All of this in 2.5 years has meant a high level of awareness. And we just received an award from the Chamber of Commerce for the area as Small Business of the Year. It was because we have shown up and taken the community seriously. We also give 10% of every new membership to a top nonprofit, $20,000 in total since we began. And then, so lastly, just for Lookout, so what we're doing based on this model and based on what we're learning from our alliance friends and partners is we are targeting 3 new sites in 2024, getting pretty close on the first of those, and as many as 10 by 2026. Based on this model, knowing that it will grow and change, but also seeing a lot of possibility beyond what we're doing today. To us, this is important, though. What do we look for in a community? And I think it's how we each think about our own markets. We're thinking of these as communities of identity. We're not thinking of like large, huge metropolitan markets. We're thinking of 250,000 to 1 million in population. It could be smaller. We're talking as small as 150,000. and what kind of community business philanthropic support is there. Public media could be an important partner in some of these markets. Using interns from journalism schools will be very important in some of them. And the student engagement program is pretty core to making our argument about community betterment and how we are trying to build these companies to last. So happy to get into discussion on any and all of that and other things that you'd like to discuss.
Thank you, Ken. I think we covered a bunch of information. Some of the people in the audience are asking if you would be so kind and generous as to share your presentation on the Zoom chat. If you can do that, that would be, I think, wonderful. Because I think there's a lot of detailed information that we would all like to dig into. Thank you.
I'll make a PDF of it and as we're talking and put it in there.
Wonderful. We appreciate it very much. I think one of the things in talking to the audience that we have here and the members of IAPA, some of us are smaller, some of us are bigger media, and there's a lot of legacy media. And we touched on this point briefly on how can legacy media, say a daily newspaper that is turning digital, and I know you mentioned some of the examples in the United States, but it seems to only be a few. What would they need to really have this transformation into these new sort of digital community engaged products that you talk about? And I know you mentioned capitalizing on brand equity and sort of the legacy of our big brand, which is, some of us, some of the media still have that and they don't want to throw that away just by starting something anew. So what would you think would be sort of the main things to look at for legacy media to really turn the page on this digital transformation process?
I think it all starts really with the audience. That one thing I saw when doing all those years of consulting, and because this question, as you know, this question has been out there for a long time, for legacy media, 20 years now. And too often I've seen media companies talk about what they have, brand equity, hugely important, the reporting force, the sales force, all of these things really important. But you put that aside over here and you say, it's 2023. Who's the audience we want to reach? And it's not one audience, right? It's several audiences. It's a number of audiences by age, by interest, by geography, all those kind of things. What do they want? What are they consuming in media today? What are the questions in their life that they want answered? And you start there with the audience to really understand what they want, and you can do it quantitatively, qualitatively. Really involve your staff in those kinds of questions. Then you start to say, this is what we've got to do to be successful. And then you match up what your resources and your assets are of your company. I think it's a really important process to start with that audience. So just like one example of that is, what devices do they use? So one reason we built Lookout to be a mobile product. So it's a good website. It's a very good website, but we were primarily concerned with the mobile product because we wanted all generations to use it. And that's worked pretty well in terms of the age split. And so if you're saying that most of your intended audience or your desired audience is going to access it on the phone, that means that they're going to use it in a different way. And so how are they going to use it? Which then, of course, gets into what kind of stories you're going to produce, at what time of day, at what length, with what kind of visuals. And then you go back to your newsroom. So it isn't that your newsroom has X number of people, but does your newsroom have the kind of staff, the kind of skills that can produce the kind of content that audience wants on the phone? And I think that cascades through every decision of how you reorient your business. And of course, the speed of reorienting it and how much you retain from print in revenue is a huge question. But I think that would be the number one thing, is start with the audience and then match up your assets and resources from there.
Thank you. I think one of the other questions that I'm sure it's in my mind and maybe in somebody else's, we see all of these products that you've put out and the incredible growth that you've achieved in 3 years. And the question in my mind is, how do you do that with 15 people in your team? And I think all of what we've seen is your successes, but I'm sure there were a lot of failures behind it. What were your bigger failures and the things that you tried that didn't work that really led you to all of these successful projects and products?
So the challenges, and there were failures, luckily none of them catastrophic. There were a lot of failures as I look back on it. I mean, the first and hardest one was launching directly into COVID.
Right.
And so if we're all about community and being out there and showing up, as I say, you couldn't show up. There was no place to show up, right? And so that was really hard for about half of our time. It also meant that for us, and it is true, we get a hell of a lot done with 15 people. You have to have the right people. So one of the advantages to a startup compared to legacy is you can pick your people. We picked some of the wrong people at the beginning. We were hiring, we wanted to hire as many local as we could, but because of the daily situation here, there wasn't much journalistic experience or talent to hire. We hired from outside and really could hardly interview people in person because of COVID. So we made mistakes in hiring, but we corrected those mistakes over the first year and a half, really the first year. And so that was hard. That is hugely important. That's really make or break. And we survived some mistakes there. But to your point, you need people who both are highly skilled. We pay, I'd say on average, 20 to 25% above what the dailies are paying for like jobs. And which is hard, it's hard in terms of the investment capital, but we wanted to get enough skill in doing that. The other mistake that we made was our access system. We work with a company called Pico, which was, and so we do have we have a really high registration wall, a low paywall you can kind of X out of. We've tried all kinds of methods there, but access control is really important to reader revenue. And we went with a company that was a newer company, supposedly designed for publications like ours, and the user experience was very poor. It cost us an additional $100,000 in 6 months to change to another company, Piano, which is the global company there. And so those are the kinds of things that are inevitable, I think, in a startup. But those are the kinds of challenges we had. What we really try to do with those 15 people, and we're all in one office, other than January 22, other than the beginning of Lookout and January 22. We are an in-office environment. People can start in a day and work at home and sometimes work at home, but in general, we're in the office. And so having 15 people in one space, it's a really good space we got, who are talking throughout the day, working together. I've been very clear as the elder in this process that it is one team of people, that the people on the business side will never tell people in the newsroom that they should publish something or should not publish something, but they should share all the information they're hearing in the community, and they're hearing a lot every day, and that people in the newsroom should listen to it. That works pretty well, and that's always been hard at newspapers. So it's one team of people. We try to share. We have meetings every 2 months to show our business progress. And so they understand this is really hard, that what we're doing is exceptional, and that both it's important journalistically, but it's important to the model that we're building. And that's hard. Most journalists in my years of experience are fairly business illiterate, and if not innumerate, and they don't really like hearing about the business. It's not completely changed, but we make point that this is a business model. They see what's going on around them with the cratering of the big daily companies, and they do understand that what they're doing is special. So giving them that information, trying to create a culture. It's pretty non-hierarchical culture. It's kind of like a newsroom culture that way of, we have a hierarchy, of course, in deciding what we're going to publish every day, as all newsrooms need. But the idea is we want the best ideas to be out there, and people feel fairly empowered, and we try to reward that.
Thank you, Ken. This has been wonderful. I feel like we need to cut it out here because we need to keep up with the agenda. So we're going to look forward to getting your presentation on this chat, and if not, please feel free to send it to our IAPA team. And if you could please share your email, because some people would like to reach out. We're all journalists.
I'm looking at the chat right now. I don't see a way to upload a PDF.
There's a little document. Right next to the emoji, and not the Q&A, but the chat. Yes.
Okay.
And if you can include your email, if that's okay. And lastly,
Sure.
we want to thank you so much. And you mentioned that you did have a column in the Nieman Lab. Where could we go and look out for the things that you're doing, you're saying you're working on? Are there any resources that you're putting out that we should be aware of and we can follow your work?
Only things that I have put out. I mean, this presentation is probably good. It's the best recent summation. I wrote wrote one piece for Neiman Reports about the philanthropic initiatives and how I thought they fit together and didn't fit together. I can put into the chat. I'll put that, and I did write for Neiman. The last I wrote, I think, was in the fall about Lookout. Pretty much it's in the same presentation here, but I'll put the Neiman Lab and the Neiman Reports links in here as well as my email.
Thank you, Ken. We really appreciate all of this information, and we really look forward to having you again.
Good, thank you very much.